Guess I'm Hataley, and I'm a PhD student at U of T, so I've come in today from Toronto. I was born in Kingston, so I've spent a lot of time on Lake Ontario, but I've never been to Sarnia, and I'm always very excited about the opportunity to see another corner of the Great Lakes, so thank you for having me here tonight. And yes, today I'm going to talk about plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. But before we get into the impact of plastic pollution on the Great Lakes, I'd like to take a step back and look at how exactly we got to the point of widespread plastic pollution that we see in today's world. And of course, it all starts with plastic production. So the figure on the slide shows global primary plastic production between 1950 and 2017. Primary plastic means virgin plastic made from petrochemical feedstock, so not recycled plastic and not bio-based plastic. So in 1950, which is widely understood as the year that global mass plastic production began, the world produced about 2 million tons of primary plastic. By 2017, that number had increased over 200 times to 438 million tons. Overall, in this time, the world produced 9,200 million tons of primary plastic. And as I'm sure you could have guessed, between 2017 and now, these numbers have only grown larger, and they are predicted to continue to do so through 2060. Now, I know I've just thrown several large numbers at you without any context, so let's switch gears and move from looking at production to looking at waste generation to try to provide some context. So this figure on the slide looks eerily similar as the last one, but it is showing us global primary plastic waste generation. So between 1950 and 2017, the world generated an estimated 6,009 million tons of primary plastic waste. And if you remembered the figure I showed on the previous slide of how much plastic was produced in this time, you'd be able to calculate that an estimated 75%, or 3/4, of all the primary plastic produced globally between 1950 and 2017 became waste. And now, if we focus on the breakdown by consuming sector, the dark blue color on the bottom that takes up about half of this graph is the packaging sector. And I think this is a perfect illustration of one of the main drivers of widespread global plastic pollution. We use a very persistent material for a lot of products with a very short lifetime. Now, of course, not all plastic waste becomes pollution. Although mismanaged plastic waste is estimated to be a very large contributor to global plastic emissions to the environment. This figure, which is from the OECD's 2022 Global Plastics Outlook report, shows an estimation of the breakdown of the sources of macroplastics and microplastics emitted to the environment in 2019. So the OECD estimates that globally, 22 million tons of plastic were emitted to the environment in 2019, 88% as macroplastics, or pieces of plastic larger than 5 millimeters in size, and 12% as microplastics, or particles of plastic less than 5 millimeters in size. Of the 88% that were macroplastics, they estimate that 93% came from mismanaged waste, so a very, very large proportion from mismanaged waste, but 6% came from litter, and 1% came from marine activities like fishing. Of the 12% that were microplastics, they estimate that 33% came from transport-related microplastics, which includes things like tire and road wear particles. 25% came from microplastics dust, and microplastics dust is a term which refers to the unintentional and uncontrollable releases of microplastics throughout the lifespan of various plastic products through abrasion. Another 25% came from wastewater sludge, so as a result of washing our clothes or using personal care products with microbeads in them. And 17% came from other sources, like industrial microplastics and artificial turf. So although plastic waste is the main contributor, plastics can be emitted to the environment throughout their life cycle, from the production phase to the use phase to the waste phase, and from many different activities, uses, and industries, Of course, plastics are omnipresent in our life, so this makes a lot of sense. In the same report, the OECD also projected annual global plastic emissions to the environment through 2060. So likely unsurprising, given all of the trends we've just discussed, they estimate that between 2019 and 2060, global plastic emissions will double from 22 million tons to 44 million tons. And this, again, is a global estimate. So now that you have a bit of a grasp on the trajectory that we're on, the logical next question may be, what is the impact of all of this plastic pollution? And that question is not so simple to answer, because the potential for impacts are wide-ranging and far-reaching, from biological level impacts, both on ecosystem and human health, to economic level impacts, to societal level impacts. The list is large, which is illustrated by this rather complex, convoluted figure on the slide. I'd like to focus on the impact of plastic pollution on ecosystem health, because this is where I spend the most of my time in my own work. Another complex figure, but hold on tight, I will explain it shortly. Organisms at every level of the food web have been reported to ingest or interact with plastics. And in lab studies, plastics have been shown to cause a variety of sublethal as well as lethal effects. Plastics themselves are a particle, so they can be physically harmful to animals via entanglement or ingestion, causing things like lacerations, suffocation, or starvation. I'm sure we've all seen images of an animal with its GIT tract showing just full of plastics, or an image of a turtle with a beer can ring around its neck. Those are physical impacts, but they can also be chemically harmful due to the complex suite of chemicals with which they are associated. So the chemical additives that are added to plastics to give them different properties, but also the other pollutants that already exist in the environment, the plastics accumulate over time. So the figure on the slide is from a systematic review that was published in 2020 that looked at studies that assessed the effects of plastic pollution on biota. The left panel summarizes studies that tested and detected a negative effect from plastic exposure, while the right panel summarizes studies that tested and did not detect a negative effect from plastic exposure. And these are broken down by two different things on the different axes. So on the y-axis, it's broken down by the level of biological organization that's tested, so from subatomic particles at the lower end to ecosystem at the higher end. And then on the x-axis, it's broken down by size of the plastic debris. So from plastic particles that are nanometers in size all the way up to pieces that are kilometers in size. So think big fishing rope. And what I'd like you to take away from this figure is that both panels look kind of the same, except if you compare the grids that represent a meter in size or larger. So you can see this area and this area. So those far larger size classes. The panels you can see all studies included in this review that tested those larger size classes detected an effect. And there's clear evidence in the literature that larger pieces of plastic, or macroplastics, harm biota. The impacts of microplastics, the smaller stuff, are a little less well understood. Some studies see effects while others don't. And in part, this is because microplastics are so diverse. No two particles are really the same. They can be different polymer types, they can be different sizes, shapes, and they represent an ever-changing and diverse chemical cocktail. And of course, these properties have a direct influence on how they impact organisms. So this is still a piece of the puzzle that researchers are trying to work out. So all of the things that we've just talked about in the introduction showcase really well why plastic pollution is often referred to as a wicked problem. It has scientific, economic, and societal complexity and uncertainty, and there exists no one single solution to address it. So I guess that's the framing of this talk. It's very, very complicated, but we're working on it. So before we jump into plastic pollution in the Great Lakes, so I hope that gave you kind of a good background of the issue. I'd like to take a minute to get up on my soapbox and talk a bit about why studying plastic pollution in freshwater environments like the Great Lakes is so important. So plastic pollution has long been seen and been talked about as a marine issue. This is from a review that was published in 2018, and it found that most of the research on plastic pollution, 87%, focused on marine systems. However, we are now beginning to realize that freshwater systems may be just as or more consequential compared to marine systems in the context of the plastic pollution problem. So this figure is again from that OECD report that I referenced earlier, and it shows their estimation of the amount of plastic that has accumulated in aquatic environments globally as of 2019, and their prediction looking forward to 2060. And this surprised me when I learned this. Both in 2019 and 2060, this report estimates that between 70 to 80% of all plastics emitted to aquatic environments globally are stored in freshwater systems. So this leaves a remaining 30 to 20% in marine systems. So that's quite a large proportion. And it, of course, has the potential of impacting these fragile freshwater ecosystems. So I believe it is very important that we pay attention to and address the issue of plastic pollution in freshwater environments like the Great Lakes. So this figure on the slide shows, as of 2022, the scientific body of literature on plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So it has grown to just over 60 publications, and you can really see on the figure in the figure on the slide that it kind of took off around 2013, and it's been going steadily since then. And studies published in the peer-reviewed literature report mostly on levels of contamination across the Great Lakes and their watersheds, but they also report on the effects on local wildlife, the sources, transport, distribution, and fate of plastics in the basin. And there's some papers that discuss the use of policies and guidelines to address the issue. And we'll review some of these studies in the next few slides. So I think a good place to start is what we know about the emissions of plastics to the Great Lakes. So there have been 2 studies published that have estimated the emission of plastics to the Great Lakes. So the first study is published in 2017, and this figure has been widely quoted in regional media, so I'm sure you've heard it before. It estimated that nearly 10,000 tons of plastics enter the Great Lakes each year. This includes 30 tons to Lake Superior, 600 tons to Lake Huron, 1,400 tons to Lake Ontario, 2,500 tons to Lake Erie, and 5,300 tons to Lake. But this model that was used to derive these estimates is based solely on municipal plastic waste generation rates. And we did learn that municipal plastic waste is a large contributor to plastic emissions, but it's not the only one. So this model is likely an underestimate because it fails to capture other important sources like aquatic activities like shipping and recreational boating and fishing, tire and road wear particles, industrial microplastics, and stuff that comes from wastewater treatment plant discharges. Just this year, though, there was a second study, a more comprehensive emissions model that includes more sources of plastic pollution as well as removal mechanisms. And it was trialed, so it is a city scale emissions model, so it's not Great Lakes scale, and it was trialed using data from the city of Toronto. So this study, the more recent study, estimates that approximately 3,700 tons of plastic waste were emitted into the environment from the city of Toronto alone in 2020. So if you compare that against the entire Lake Ontario estimate from the 2017 study, it's about 2.5 times greater. So this really does showcase that 2017 study is likely a mass underestimate, and in reality, there's much more than 1,400 tons of plastic entering Lake Ontario annually, and much more than 10,000 tons of plastic entering the Great Lakes annually. So now if we move on to levels of contamination. So in terms of what we know, this is a summary of 43 different studies that have been published as of 2023 that characterize and quantify plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So So they look at how much is in there and then what the particles themselves look like. Their polymer type, their shape, their color, their size. And it's broken down by lake as well as the matrix studied. And the different matrix types are water, sediment, beachy shorelines, and biota. And the studies summarized here are specific to microplastic pollution. So we're kind of going to leave macroplastic pollution back now and only talk about microplastic pollution moving forward. There's been much less work done on microplastic pollution in terms of monitoring. It's only been quantified and characterized on shorelines in the Great Lakes. So we'll focus just on microplastics. So for microplastics, to date, at least one study has been performed in each matrix in each Great Lake. So there's been a study that's looked at water, sediment, beachy shorelines, and biotas in all 5 of the Great Lakes. And there's some from Lake St. Clair as well. Surface water remains the most sampled matrix, followed by sediment, beachy shoreline, and then biota. And the most studies have been performed in Lake Michigan, followed by Lakes Erie, Ontario, Erie, Superior, and then Huron. So before we look at more detail in terms of the level of pollution, so we actually look at the numbers from these studies, I want to emphasize that because the field of microplastics lacks standardized or even harmonized methods for sampling and analysis, it's really difficult to compare between studies because they use such different methods. So although in the next few slides you'll hear me say things like this lake appears more polluted than this lake, take this with a grain of salt. It's really preliminary, and in order to make real direct comparisons, we need much more comprehensive sampling that uses harmonized methods across the entire basin. So the data presented in the next few slides is really a preliminary assessment of spatial trends and collecting more comparable and consistent data for better understandings of spatial but also temporal trends is a really big need regionally. So this figure shows concentrations of microplastics reported in water samples collected from the Great Lakes. So we have the 5 Great Lakes and Lake St. Clair plotted. And based on the studies reviewed, water samples from Lake Michigan appear to have the highest mean concentration of microplastics, followed by Lakes Erie and Ontario, which is then followed by Lakes Huron and Superior. There have only been 2 studies that sampled in Lake St. Clair, and in Lake St. Clair, microplastic concentrations appear to be comparable to Lakes Ontario and Erie. And additionally, studies have sampled in different places in the lake, so both in offshore sites and in tributary sites. And tributary sites generally report higher microplastic concentrations than studies that sampled offshore in the lakes, which of course makes sense because the tributaries are often closer to where the people are, and where the people are, the plastic is. Our next figure shows microplastics in sediment samples. So for sediment, again, Lake Michigan appears to have the highest mean concentration of microplastics. Lakes Erie, Ontario, Erie, and Huron have the next highest reported concentrations, followed by Lake Superior. And no studies have looked at sediments in Lake St. Clair yet. And here it's a little bit more difficult to discern any trends between near-shore sampling sites or tributary sampling sites or shoreline sampling locations. But again, this is very preliminary assessment. This isn't the right data to really make a robust assessment on trends in locations within the lakes. But unfortunately, it's all we have. And then in terms of biota, so for biota, there have been 28 species that have been studied in the Great Lakes, most commonly fish, and followed by mussels and birds and amphibians and also algae. Most of this work has been done in Lakes Michigan and Ontario, and no studies so far have sampled biota in Lake St. Clair. And fish is the only class of biota that has been sampled across all 5 Great Lakes. Lake Ontario had the highest reported microplastics per individual in fish, followed closely by Lake Michigan and then by Lake Superior, Erie, and Huron. So there's some trends with Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan often coming out on top in terms of highest concentrations. So I believe that the question that follows all of this data is, what do these levels of pollution mean in terms of ecosystem and human health risk? And before I try to answer that question, I want to discuss some very recent and relevant work of an international joint commission work group on microplastics, which I was involved in leading. So keep that question in the back of your mind. What do these concentrations mean in terms of ecosystem and human health risk? And we'll come back to it after we talk about some of the tools that the IJC has been working to create that can help us answer those questions. So just some brief background on work that the IJC has been involved in on the issue of microplastics in the Great Lakes. So the first effort, IJC effort that was relevant to plastic pollution was a microplastics watching brief. And this was developed in 2015. And the Microplastics Watching Brief is an online living document that summarizes regional points of interest related to microplastics and plastics more broadly, spanning science, policy, and media. So it's kind of like an ongoing living literature review. The following year, in 2016, the IJC hosted a workshop on microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes, the main purpose being to develop recommendations for addressing challenges posed by the issue. A workshop report was published in 2016, and then following it, a document outlining 10 official IJC recommendations was released in 2017. So the work group that I've been involved in leading, which was convened in 2022, is working towards addressing 2 of those 10 recommendations released in 2017 by the IJC. The first being to develop harmonized sampling methods for microplastics. So I know previously I talked about how that's a big need in the region, so we can actually compare what we see around the region. So that's the first thing we've been working to do, is these harmonized sampling methods. And the second is to develop a framework to assess ecological health impacts. So to try to answer that question, what do these concentrations mean for our ecosystems? And there has been much work in the past decade, both locally in the Great Lakes region, but also globally, that has enabled our work group to actually tackle these recommendations over the past 2 years. It was probably only really feasible to do this in the last 2 years. Specifically, there's been a lot of work out of California, led by a work group, an international work group down there. And this all came about in 2018 because the California legislature passed 2 bills that required the state create tools to, 1, collect environmental samples for microplastics analysis, 2, tools to quantify and characterize microplastics in environmental samples, and 3, assess and manage both, tools to assess and manage both ecological and human health risk. So these tools sound a lot like what we were trying to do here in the Great Lakes. So they had convened several work groups from 2018 up until 2022, right when we started, to create these tools. So instead of doing all the work again for a second time, our group has closely collaborated with the California group and is recommending a lot of their tools for use here in the Great Lakes after they've been adapted accordingly for local relevance. So this is just summarizes the overarching objectives and goals of our work group. So our overarching goal was to develop and advance frameworks for monitoring as well as assessing and managing the ecological risks of microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes. And we had 3 objectives that fell within that goal. And today I'm really going to focus on the 3rd objective because again, that's relevant to answering that question of what do these concentrations mean. So the 3rd objective was to develop a risk assessment framework focused on ecological effects to contextualize the result of a monitoring program. And in terms of our timeline, as I mentioned, we began in the fall of 2022, and just over the summer, we wrapped up all of our deliverables, and they're currently off with the IJC for their final check. So in the coming months, all of the things that we've created and to work towards our objectives will be released publicly. As I mentioned earlier, one of the goals of the California Work Group was to develop a risk assessment and management framework for ecological and human health risks posed by microplastics. So unfortunately, they couldn't do that for human health risks because there wasn't enough data that existed in the literature. They did, however, successfully develop frameworks relevant to ecological health risk for exposure to microplastics in water. So on the left-hand side, you'll see their management framework. So their management framework is a multi-tiered risk management framework. It has 5 management tiers that range from no to high regulatory concern, and then 4 associated risk thresholds the values of which are shown on the table on the right-hand side of the screen. And then each management tier comes with a recommendation. So low concern recommends that you increase monitoring frequency, and at the high end, when you're at high concern, the recommendation is to implement pollution control measures. So our Great Lakes Microplastics Work Group took this framework and adapted it to make it more relevant to the Great Lakes ecosystem, so meaning for a freshwater ecosystem, because of course California was working with a marine ecosystem, as well as the Great Lakes governance structure. So we wanted to align the framework to the State of the Great Lakes reporting scheme, which is mandated under Annex 10 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So this is our framework. So as you can see, we changed the management tiers to be representative of ecosystem health status, so from undetermined to good to fair to poor, which is how ecosystem health metrics are reported on in the State of the Great Lakes report. And then we populated our risk management framework with 2 risk thresholds. The first threshold is a value which represents the concentration of microplastic at which 5 species in a community are impacted, called the HC5 value, and it sits between the good and the fair tiers. And threshold 2 represents the concentration at which 30% of species in a community are impacted, or the HC30 value. It sits between the good and the fair tiers. So we also tried to do this for sediment. So these threshold values are specific to exposure in water. That's why they're in per liter. But there wasn't enough data to do this yet for sediment. So that is something that once more data becomes available in the future, can be done. But as more data becomes available, these values will be updated. So the importance of this work is less about these 2 values, but more about the process in deriving the values. But for interest's sake, we can take these preliminary thresholds and compare them against concentrations of microplastics reported in the Great Lakes and try to go back and answer that question: what do these levels of pollution mean in terms of ecosystem health risk? So that's what this next figure does. So there's a line for each lake, and the lines represent concentrations of microplastic that have been reported in samples collected from each lake. And you can see the concentrations are overlaid on the 2 thresholds, so threshold 1 and threshold 2. So you can see from this figure, so the dark green over here is Lake Ontario and the light green is Lake Michigan. So when we were talking, we talked a lot about higher concentrations in these 2 lakes. So these 2 lakes have samples that have been collected that exceed this preliminary second threshold, whereas the other 3 lakes, Erie, Superior, and Huron, all of the samples collected in these lakes really remain below the first threshold. So this is a preliminary assessment because there's lots of room for improvement on these threshold values, but it does show that in hot spots where current concentrations are high, the health of Great Lakes ecosystems may already be at risk from exposure to microplastics in water, but this risk is not basin-wide. So we're not seeing it across all 5 Great Lakes. We also talked about human health risk, and as I mentioned, the California work group was not able to derive human health risk thresholds relevant to exposure to microplastics in drinking water because of a lack of data. But I do have 2 recent studies to share that are relevant to the Great Lakes. So these are 2 studies that quantified microplastics in sport fish caught in the Great Lakes to inform human exposure. So in Lake Simcoe, the fish that were caught, they were found to have, some of them had no particles in their fillets, but some of them had up to 72 particles per individual in their fillet, so in the part of the fish that humans commonly eat. And then in Lake Ontario, the particles per individual in the fillet ranged from 0 again in some fish, but up to 284 particles per individual. So the occurrence of microplastics in the fillets should suggest bioavailability to humans when we eat sport fish, and that was hypothesized by both of these studies. And the figures I'm showing on the board, they're actually calculating estimated yearly intake based on consumption of 2 servings of fish. I told you that we're continuing to make more and more plastic every year. Plastic waste, greater plastic emissions to the environment. I've told you that the potential for impacts from plastic pollution are wide-ranging, from those that are biological, economical, to societal. I've told you that plastic pollution in freshwater environments is a big deal, and we see this in the Great Lakes, with microplastics now reported in every lake and in every matrix. And I've told you that some places in the Great Lakes may already be at risk from microplastics exposure. So what do we do with all of this information? There are likely many answers to that question, but I've been particularly interested in the answers contained in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement addresses plastic pollution in part, Annex 5, which is discharges from vessels, which prohibits the discharge of garbage, including plastic, from vessels in Great Lakes waters. However, research shows that an estimated 80% of plastic pollution in aquatic environments originates from land-based sources, with the remaining 20% coming from water-based sources. So this means that currently the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is mitigating at best less than 1/5 of the sources of plastic pollution to the Great Lakes. So I believe that the use of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement could be expanded using 2 additional annexes, Annex 3, Chemicals of Mutual Concern, and Annex 10, Science, to facilitate a more comprehensive approach to addressing plastic pollution across the region. So we already touched a bit on Annex 10. I talked about the framework that the IJC work group had created. It was aligned to the State of the Great Lakes reports, which are mandated under Annex 10. If microplastics were included as a toxic chemical sub-indicator for ecosystem health under Annex 10, it would necessitate that the governments consistently monitor and report on levels of microplastics monitoring programs. As I mentioned, a big need, so we actually have comparable data and we can assess spatial and temporal trends across the Great Lakes. So this would be helpful in terms of management because it would enable us to identify sources of microplastic pollution. We could track trends in time, and we could also evaluate the effectiveness of management action. So is what we're doing working to actually curb the pollution we're seeing in the lakes? And that's also where Annex 3 comes in. So if microplastics were designated as a chemical of mutual concern under Annex 3, it would also necessitate that governments compile binational strategy reports for microplastics and then begin to implement some risk mitigation and management options to reduce the emissions of plastics to the Great Lakes.
Well, I think we're going to have to hold it there. I just would like to thank Eden for her fantastic presentation. Obviously, it's a topic on everybody's mind. There's a lot of great questions from the crowd here on plastics. I think there's going to be a lot of further research and you know what's happening, how it's impacting the environment, what we can do about it coming down the road. So maybe we'll see you back here again down the road to talk about it. We have a very small gift of our appreciation for you coming tonight. We really appreciate you staying here.
Yeah, thank you for coming out this evening. It is a really good turnout, and one of the main reasons we have this annual event is to make sure the community is updated as to the progress in restoring the St. Clair River. So you heard Eden mention the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Well, it was in 1987 that St. Clair River was designated as an area of concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And the reason for that was because a number of beneficial uses were impaired because of human activities. And you saw the slide she had up showed Annex 1, what was their area of concern. So that's where it was captured. And there's been a lot of work, great work done in the St. Clair River over the 30+ years to restore it, to address those beneficial uses. So what I want to do this evening is cover off 4 key points. I want to talk about the St. Clair River area of concern, what the geographical area is, talk about the beneficial use impairments and the work that's been done to address them. Then I want to talk about some of the significant accomplishments and achievements over the 30+ years, and talk about some of the actions that we have remaining in place to address the remaining beneficial use impairments, and then wrap up by identifying some opportunities for future recovery efforts on the St. Clair River. St. Clair River area of concern, the green shaded area you see here on this image. So the balance beam on the left shows how things looked in 1991. And only 2 beneficial uses were not impaired. Those are the green icons, and did not require an action plan to restore them. 9 were impaired. Those are the red icons. And 3 required further assessment to make a determination as to whether or not they were impaired. And those are the yellow icons. Action plans were developed to address these impaired beneficial uses. And as you can see from the balance beam on the right-hand side of the slide, we've come a long way since 1991. And we now have 10 beneficial uses that are not impaired. And we're currently focusing on our efforts on addressing those 4 remaining beneficial uses right here on this right-hand side of the beam. So this slide here, then, I want to show this one to progress made in both the Canadian and U.S. side. So you see the status in Canada, there's 14 beneficial uses, so each of them are listed there, and on the American side. So there that are all not impaired anymore. Great progress made over the years. And on the Canadian side, between 2018 and 2024, there were 5 beneficial uses that were redesignated to not impaired. So great progress has been occurring recently in that regard. And the Binational Public Advisory Council, also known as the BPAC group, held a celebration in 2022 to recognize the redesignation of 4 of these beneficial use impairments. And that group is now considering opportunities to celebrate the redesignation of the 5th one, and that's the restrictions on drinking water consumption or taste and odor problems. So that was a lot of work went into that one too, to be able to redesignate that. So that was only just recently redesignated in June of this year. So like I said, we're looking for opportunities to work with BPAC and celebrating that. And when celebrating these significant milestones, BPAC often makes a point. They make a point of reaching out to our partners on the U.S. side as well and getting together to recognize the great work that everybody's put in, the collaborative effort to be able to achieve another milestone and redesignate a BUI. So in my next slides, I'll highlight some of the actions that have contributed to restoring the St. Clair River and provide some examples of the collaborative effort that was required to complete the work and gather the data to demonstrate the success. So it was during the initial stages of the remedial action plan, when the problems were being identified and corrective actions were being developed, a binational group called the RAP team was put in place. And it was created to develop the remedial action plan and to ensure public involvement was incorporated into the development of that plan. And once the necessary actions were identified for each side of the border, the Canadian Remedial Action Plan Implementation Committee was put in place. And that's what's been they're the team that's been in place since that time, with a mandate to organize the work associated with restoration of the beneficial uses on the Canadian side. And this slide shows you who's represented on the RAP Implementation Committee. You have Environment Climate Change Canada at the federal level, 3 provincial agencies, the Conservation Authority, who I'm here to represent today, the Local Health Unit, and 3 municipalities, 2 First Nation communities, industries represented by the Blue Water Association for Safety, Environment, and Sustainability, and the Binational Public Advisory Council group that I mentioned, they're represented on that as well, and Rural Lambton Stewardship Network. They did a lot of work in restoration of wetlands. So it's taken all these groups working together to make the achievements over the years. And I do want to mention also that funding for this remedial action program has continued to be provided by Environment Climate Change Canada and the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And it's because of that funding that we're also able to have this event this evening to provide an update to the community. So since the CRIC's formation, I call it the CRIC in short, is a number of notable and significant activities have been completed and legislative initiatives enforced that have improved the environmental health of the St. Clair River. So I'm just going to highlight some of those things, some of the significant accomplishments over the years. Been a lot of work done by the City of Sarnia to eliminate their combined sewer overflows, with some more work planned in that area. Major financial investments required for that. A lot of work done by industry to improve their wastewater discharges, and also to implement spill prevention measures. And there's been upgrades by the City of Sarnia to the St. Andrew Street wastewater pollution control plant. That certainly has benefited the St. Clair River. And upgrades to the in St. Clair Township. They've built the Courtright wastewater treatment plant, and I understand they're looking at some potential upgrades there as well to handle additional capacity. There's been ongoing what we call shoreline softening work efforts to replace the sheet pile walls along the river with armor stone. If you've been along St. Clair River, you'll see that work occurring. And it also, not only does it control erosion, it helps to improve fish and wildlife habitat. There's been the cleanup of the contaminated sediment along the shoreline there of the former Dow Canada property in 2005. And then more recently, an assessment of the remedial options for addressing the contaminated sediment that as at 3 locations further downstream in the St. Clair River, including the development of an engineering design plan to address that contaminated sediment. And that was completed in 2021. So all those things really went a long way to improving water quality in the river. Just trying to get my next slide going here. Here we go. Okay, and in terms of some additional things, I'm looking at wetlands here now. Over 300 hectares of valuable wetlands has been restored or enhanced within the area of concern. And primarily along the eastern shore of St. Clair and on the Walpole Island First Nation Delta. And the slide shows here is it's showing a before and after picture of the Gifford wetland, where alterations were made to once again open the wetland to the river channel and making it a much better habitat for fish and wildlife. So a number of those projects were completed over the years, because it's very important to be able to make progress on addressing these beneficial uses. Before and after picture of the Swan Lake Marsh on Walpole Island First Nation. That was a major project to do that one. And again, you can see how the wetland has been improved through the water level management, invasive species management, a lot of effort to manage Phragmites in all these wetlands, native plantings, an important thing, and dike repair work as well to make it a much better habitat for fish and wildlife. What I wanted to mention in this next couple of slides is working with Walpole Island First Nation. So in addition to habitat restoration, there's been significant collaboration with Walpole Island on surveys and studies. One of which was a month in duration, where Walpole Island First Nation members joined Department of Fisheries and Oceans field teams to collect fish habitat and fish community data. This was the most comprehensive fish habitat and fish community survey of Walpole Island First Nation bays and channels. It was 3 weeks of surveys, day and night, with 1 week of pre-project training for Walpole Island First Nation members who augmented the DFO field crews. The information collected during the project indicated that Delta provides valuable fish habitat and has high fish diversity. So great work with the community, a collaborative effort there, and great to see those results. There's also been significant collaboration with Walpole Island on fish and wildlife related studies. So in 2014, the fish tumor study involved Walpole Island First Nation collecting fish to assess them for liver cancer. The fish processing station was set up at one of the hunt clubs at Walpole Island First Nation. Of the 60 brown bullhead livers collected in the 2013-2014 study from the waters around Walpole Island, no liver tumors were found. So in terms of where we are focusing our efforts right now, we're currently conducting community engagement on the beneficial use impairment for degraded fish and wildlife populations. It was initially identified as requiring further assessment, and that assessment work has now been completed, and a report has been prepared recommending that it be redesignated to not impaired. So this slide here highlights some of the key findings from that assessment report that support that recommendation. While changes in diversity and abundance in aquatic wildlife populations have occurred, wildlife populations are currently similar to or better than those in areas outside of the St. Clair River area of concern. That's the common way they look at assessing a beneficial use. How does it look outside of the St. Clair River area? In terms of contaminated levels in fish and wildlife, they have declined or remained stable over the last few decades. Although legacy contaminants such as mercury and PCBs were higher in fish and wildlife from within the area of concern compared to other sites around the Great Lakes, the levels were below thresholds associated with adverse effects on growth, reproduction, and survival. So based on the studies conducted, contaminant burdens are not impairing the ability of fish and wildlife populations to be self-sustaining. Important finding there, and that's what we're engaging the communities on right now. I think we're looking at getting to Walpole First Nation community next to speak to them more about that one. And for this one here, with respect to the beneficial use dealing with loss of fish and wildlife habitat, there's been a lot of work done to date to assess the delisting criteria for that BUI, not just to address the delisting criteria, the actions, to implement the actions, but then actually assessing them individually and making sure we met the criteria. So 7 habitat restoration criteria have been met as a result of based on that assessment that was completed. Restoration goals included increasing habitat quantity, increasing habitat quality, naturalizing the shoreline, removing the sheep pile walls, replacing with armor stone, vegetating tributaries to mitigate impacts from runoff, and improving connectivity at key fish and wildlife areas. So that could be working on the wetlands or connecting wooded areas, Bickford Oak Woods, connecting with Amjanaw, connecting with Walpole Island, looking at those types of things. And as I previously mentioned, over 300 hectares of habitat has been created or enhanced in priority areas of the area of concern, exceeding what was initially a restoration target of 155 hectares. Now, in terms of what are we going to do next, where are we focusing our efforts after that, there are just 2 beneficial use impairments that are left to be addressed. And we have action plans identified in our current work plan to address those. One activity to be completed that will help us to move forward for both of these is implementation of the sediment management plan, involving application of an erosion-resistant cover in targeted areas where the contaminated sediment has been identified downstream of the St. Clair River. So we're waiting for an update from Dow Canada and the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks on when that work is going to be able to proceed. I understand that various permits and approvals are in place, so it's a matter of lining up the materials and the equipment to make it happen. So when looking at future opportunities, so even though there has been a lot of work done to date to restore the river and enhance wetland areas, we know there is more that can be done. Just want to list some examples here on this slide. You know, all aquatic restoration sites require continued treatment of the invasive Phragmites species. It keeps coming back to the wetlands. I'm sure if you've been out to look at any around here, you'll see it. And it's quite a challenge to stay on top of it. And I'm sure you hear there's research going on exploring ways to better manage that. So wetlands require ongoing maintenance related to restoring and maintaining dikes and maintaining water levels through operation and repair of pumps. So you just can't ignore that. Efforts to reconnect wetlands in the delta that have been diked could create over 1,000 hectares of additional in the area of concern. Opportunities there to consider down. Continued monitoring of habitat restoration areas would help to quantify the complex long-term benefits of these restoration efforts. Be nice to see that. And there are other methods for ongoing conservation of aquatic habitat where time and effort could be applied. Things like education and outreach is always important. Land securement, you know, where can you secure lands for wetland development, and just traditional land management. So now that we are getting closer to delisting the St. Clair River as an area of concern, we are having discussions on matters related to how will the St. Clair River be dealt with after delisting? So we expect it'll transition over to what's called the Lake Erie Lake-Wide Action Management Plan. And it's LAMP for short, LAMP, so the Lake Erie LAMP is covered under that program. So not to be forgotten. We also expect that government agencies will continue with their regular compliance and monitoring programs to ensure that St. Clair River does not return to its previous condition, given the level of effort that has taken to be able to get to where we are today and eventually delist it as an area of concern.
I'm the Canadian co-chair for the St. Clair River Area of Concern by National Public Advisory Council, and with me is Jackie. We were already introduced, thank you, and we're both on the Friends of St. Clair River. So a little bit about our background. One of our initiatives is to, we're going to make you hopefully aware of some of our outreach plans. We're volunteer registered charity, Canadian charity, registered in 1996, and we support implementation of the St. Clair River Area of Concern. And if you look at that diagram on the scale on the left, you see the bubbles moving to the green. That's part of our initiative, is to help to move those BUIs to the green. So our role is conservation, beautification, and environmental restoration all along the Canadian shore, and there is a fantastic group on the U.S. side called the Friends of the U.S. We are on the board of directors. There's about 10 of us on here. We have some members here, Terry Burrell and Brenda Lorenz. I think, I don't know if there's anybody else here from Friends. Anyway, we have about 10 members. So and we're primarily funded by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Some of our projects is the Chatham-Kent-Lambton Children's Water Festival, and this year it's on October the 1st to the 3rd. Every year they have that at the C.M. Wilson Conservation Area. Has anybody here been to the Children's Water Festival? Can I show of hands? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got a couple, 5. That's great. If you get a chance to go to it's just south of Chatham, and there are students, both elementary and high school students. The elementary come to participate, and the high school students help as mentors. And you've got about 50 different stations, and it's all about games, but at the same time they're learning about the ecosystem in their area. It's fantastic. And if you want to help sponsor them, please consider that. We also support the Blue Water Anglers Hatchery in Point Edward to operate the hatchery. We also support the Classroom Education Partnership with the Conservation Authority. And from the previous question, by the way, the St. Clair Conservation Authority helps to fund Mike's role right now, as well as any of the other things that we need to run the BPAC program. So there is a lot of cooperation with the Conservation Authority. Some of the wetland projects that we have is we're in partnership with the Rural Lambton Stewardship Network, and these are biologists that understand about Phragmites and native plants, and we help to fund some of those projects. Tree planting at Walpole Island First Nation as well. There's 2 public outreach projects right now that we have currently underway, and those are the ones we'd like to speak about tonight. One involves the information signs. If you've gone along the parkway, you might see some of our signs, and the other one is the photo contest. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, and she's going to talk about those.
Hello everyone, I'm Jackie, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our signs. Anybody here take lovely walks along the river with their dog or their kids or just themselves? Take note of some of the signs that we have put up. The purpose of the sign project was to create 5 informative signs to promote the importance of the St. Clair River. These signs aim to educate the community about the value in working with our partners on the U.S. side, the significance of restoration efforts, the role of the river as a vital source of drinking water, habitat restoration successes, diverse fish populations, and rich biodiversity of aquatic and terrestrial wildlife. With the support of the Village of Point Edward, the City of Sarnia, and St. Clair Township, these signs are being strategically placed along the river shoreline at popular community access points. 3 signs have been installed in Point Edward. We are collaborating with the Sarnia to have 5 places in Centennial Park area, and with St. Clair Township we have 3 placed in Brandor Park and in Courtright Park and the Guthrie Park. Anybody familiar with those parks? Yes. The next five slides that we're going to see will provide a brief overview of the contents of each of the signs created. Sign number 1. The sign titled A Binational Success Story provides information on how addressing the St. Clair River area of concern is a joint effort between Canada and the United States, focusing on pollution prevention and habitat restoration. Notable restoration projects on the U.S. side include the Blue Water River Walk and Marysville Living Shoreline. On the Canadian side, they indicate the Guthrie Park Shoreline Protection Project and wetland restoration projects along the east shore of Lake St. Clair and Walpole Islands First Nations. The sign emphasizes the importance of community involvement and cross-border cooperation in improving water quality and restoring natural habitats. Yes, the second sign. The sign explains that the St. Clair River is a crucial source of drinking water for both Ontario and Michigan, serving over 200,000 residents. The sign details the location of the water treatment plants along the river and explains how water quality is regulated and monitored by various agencies in both Canada and the United States. It emphasizes the importance of pollution prevention measures, including strict discharge regulations for industries and the implementation of spill notification system. The next slide, the next sign. This sign explains how the St. Clair River was designated as an area of concern in 1987 due to the industrial discharges, municipal wastewater discharge, urban runoff, and habitat loss. It provides a status update on the beneficial use impairments, indicating progress in removing impairments and ongoing efforts to address the remaining issues. Next slide. The next sign. For this sign, we wanted to focus on providing information on how the St. Clair River provides various and unique habitats for fish and other aquatic organisms influenced by water depth, flow, and temperature. It emphasizes the importance of natural shorelines in preventing erosions and providing food and shelter for wildlife. It also highlights common fish species in the St. Clair River, such as walleye, lake sturgeon, and smallmouth bass. The next sign is this last sign that we created explains how the St. Clair River is the ideal area for creating fish and wildlife habitat, focusing on reversing the impacts of industrialization and urban development. Highlights include the Prairie Passage Project and the Branton-Condick wetland creation, which aim to restore natural habitats and improve biodiversity. Local organizations and partnerships play a crucial role in habitat restoration efforts, emphasizing the importance of community engagement. The sign provides information on ongoing conservation efforts and encourages public awareness and participation in preserving the river's ecosystem. That summarizes the information that we wanted to share with you this evening on our sign project. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is a little exciting here, is we have 2024. We are inviting all amateur digital photographers to submit pictures of the St. Clair River over the next 2 months that capture images of how efforts to restore the St. Clair River have succeeded. The main topic of it is celebrating recovery on the St. Clair is the theme for this 4th digital photography contest. The contest is open to all amateur photographers living in the St. Clair River watershed in both Canada and the United States. Photos submitted are to have been taken in 2024, and the contestants may submit a maximum of 3 photographs, and the contest categories are natural and wildlife, youth under 18, and digital perspective. A panel of judges will select a winning photo, and the cash prizes totaling in $3,000 will be awarded. All photographs are to be submitted to the Friends of St. Clair River by way of following the email address.
Hello, first time coming to AOC meeting, so thank you first and foremost for having us here. This is incredible to learn a lot of this stuff. Give a little background on the first slide here. A lot of people probably know the term Sarnia Lambton Environmental Association. What was SLEA, S-L-E-A, is now the Environmental Programs in BASIS. A lot of people are probably familiar with the IEC Training Center, which is the safety and training side. So now under the BASIS umbrella, managing a lot of the programs through the environmental division. And one of those major programs, one of the main topics of it all, is the air monitoring network. Now you guys aren't here to listen to air, you're here to listen to water. And within the Sarnia Lambton Environmental Association, what was the network includes a downriver water monitoring station. Now with BASIS, what we're doing is we're kind of revamping that all and diving into some of the details of it all. Background, it's been, I want to say, ballpark 40 years it's been operating, measuring downriver VOCs, so your benzenes and toluenes and very, very low level detections and such. There's an auto sampling system that pulls from an intake underwater that's downstream of a lot of industry, and it's kind of a collective operation so that we can monitor anything coming downstream before it hits downriver water users. So that would be your Walpole, your Wallaceburg, any of the intakes and such, and any other private users as well. With the station downriver, a lot of the automated system is something that was customized many, many years ago, and my time in the network is nearing on 20 years. Historically maintaining the station and the equipment and everything, now managing the program with contract companies. With that old equipment, eventually time ages everything. It wore out. There's absolutely nothing in replacement. It's kind of an oddball setup. That's an automated system that can sample the water automatically, use a purge system that purges the chemicals out of the water, and then analysis goes on to a computer, sent electronically server, websites, all this stuff. This system, because it isn't really a very widely used system, we've had to revamp using something brand new, something fully customized. With any of this system, this is used mainly as a reporting function for emergency response systems. If there's a spill upriver from any of the industry members or any City of Sarnia incidents, anything like that upriver can be caught in some of the VOCs. We also monitor water temperature, pH levels, some simple things like that. But one thing that people don't understand is not only is this used as an emergency tool, but it's also used as a huge, widely ranged study. The historical data has been used in all kinds of things, and a lot of the people speaking here today have probably looked at the data to some degree. And with that, we wanted to continue forward, and my presentation will be short, I promise. What we're going to do here, I'm going to dive into some of that in the future, but what we've done here, the bottom picture is the new system. Now, it doesn't look anything crazy, but essentially what it is customized lab equipment. And in a lab, you're maintaining it one sample at a time. You're ensuring that everything is perfect. But with our system downriver, something that nobody does is it's fully remote. It's completely automated, and it's measuring at levels that a lot of people don't even understand. So when you talk about air stuff, you're talking about parts per million. Parts per billion is 1,000 down from that. In water, we're looking at 2, almost 3 decimal places of ppb, parts per billion. So we're looking almost PPT level. And a lot of people running in labs, as you mentioned in your presentation, to get into the microplastics and the nanoplastics beyond that, we're measuring that in water to some degree, but it's unfortunately only VOCs, and it's an oddly customized tailored system, so it's really, really complicated to do anything outside of some of the chemicals that we're measuring for. Of course, being historic, we wanted to keep that trend going, so we had that statistical data, so we're trying to adapt to what we had previously to continue that trend, but we're also trying to adapt to new. And with this downriver water system, we're in discussion with ministry, conservation authorities and such for downriver water users. We're in conversation with international groups, with all the industry members that are BASIS members. We're also in discussion with what is first time now having a water group, as we call it, and it's a discussion on what do we need to measure, how many locations do we need to measure it, how often do we need to measure it, can we tailor the system to do that, can we do a little bit more, can we do it easier, can we do it more reliably, but to ensure that we're always getting at least the minimum quality of a lot of that. And I know there's been a lot of question about some of the downriver stuff, but always adapting. And one of the conversations over the last year, roughly, I looked at Jason for a little reference on that, ballpark about a year in putting new equipment in to support this endeavor is, do we need something at this level? Do we need to measure the VOCs? And I know there's familiar faces in here that worked on VOC versus a TOC, so a total organic. And it ended up going through a lot of council, a lot of committees, a lot of discussions, and it was basically, let's replace what we had and continue those conversations forward, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. But we're trying to expedite that so we don't fall behind on anything, especially with the way equipment's moving. We're trying to make one step forward at all time. We're trying to create all kinds of reliability in a customized system that's really, really tough to do, but we're getting there. And, oh, that's the other slide. Oops. One last note on that, for the first time ever in the Sarnia area, a lot of people in this room are probably very familiar with the air monitoring website, CASA. Public data from ministry stations as well as our basis network, all of that stuff is live. For the first time ever, we're going to bring this water data live to everybody. We want this to be publicly available. We want absolutely nothing hidden. Industry supports this completely. We've got a ton of people on board. The ministry's all about it. Water and air sides are in great support of it. First time, it's going to be a tough pull. It's going to be very, very difficult, so please be patient as the equipment bugs are worked out over the next couple of years for reliability and maintenance and such. But we're hoping to have this live with our new revamp of the CASA website coming towards the year end. And I know Chris Lee's got an eye on that as well. So we're pretty excited about it. It's going to be huge, and we're going to introduce new compounds, and we're going to be able to easily change the system. If we decide some of these compounds that were decided on over 20 years ago, maybe we need to change that compound list. Maybe we need to measure something a little different. Maybe there's studies coming out that we didn't even know some of these plastics and chemicals are in the water. Let's adapt to it. Let's reevaluate the entire system and keep that public. And there's the short and sweet of it all.